To enjoy this episode ad-free, please visit patreon.com/forensictales.
Forensic Tales discusses topics that some listeners may find disturbing. The contents of this episode may not be suitable for everyone. Listener discretion is advised.
Some murder cases are solved by DNA. Others reveal just how dangerously it can be misunderstood. On November 2nd, 2007, 21-year-old British exchange student Meredith Kercher was found murdered inside the Italian home she shared with American student Amanda Knox. Within days, Amanda and her new boyfriend were arrested. Prosecutors claimed a kitchen knife from his apartment carried Amanda's DNA on its handle and Meredith's on its blade. But independent experts later identified serious problems with how this evidence was collected and tested, including the possibility of contamination. Meanwhile, another man's DNA, fingerprints, bloody palm print, and shoe prints were found at the crime scene. So did forensic evidence uncover everyone responsible for Meredith Kercher's murder? Or did questionable DNA help send two innocent people to prison? This is Forensic Tales, episode 346, The Murder of Meredith Kercher. Welcome to Forensic Tales. I'm your host, Courtney Fretwell. Forensic Tales is a weekly true crime podcast with a forensic twist. Each episode features real stories, highlighting how forensic science was used to uncover the truth. If you enjoy deep dives into real cases and the science behind them, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you want even more content, including monthly, full-length bonus episodes, and early ad-free access to over 300 episodes, you can join our community over on Patreon. The support there truly helps keep this show going. To learn more, visit patreon.com/forensictales. And one small favor that makes a huge difference for the show. If you're enjoying Forensic Tales, please consider leaving a positive review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps other listeners discover the podcast. To understand how a few microscopic biological traces became powerful enough to shape an international murder case, we first need to understand who Meredith Kercher was and what brought her to Italy. Known as Mez to her friends, Meredith grew up in the southern outer reaches of London and was the youngest of 4 children, with older brothers John and Lyle and sister Stephanie. The 2 most common words I found during my research for Meredith were loving and sociable, and in almost every photo of her, she's smiling. After attending an all-girls high school, she enrolled at the University of Leeds to study Italian and European politics. She had always been fascinated by both the Italian culture and language, and hoped to someday work for the European Union or as a journalist. By the fall of 2007, Meredith saw her upcoming study abroad program to Italy as a dream trip. The plan was to study at the University of Perugia and learn about modern history, political theories, and the history of cinema. She had specifically chosen that city over Milan and Rome because she thought it would be safer. The Italian city she chose has only about 150,000 residents, and almost a quarter are students, most of them from abroad. So when she got there, Meredith moved into a 4-bedroom, first-floor flat with 2 Italian women in their late 20s, Filomena Romanelli and Laura Mazzetti, as well as a 20-year-old American student from the University of Washington, Amanda Knox. Then underneath that, 4 Italian men lived in the downstairs apartment with whom the girls were said to be friendly. Although Meredith and Amanda are often described simply as roommates, they hadn't known each other very long, and they were still getting to know each other. Then, just 3 months after leaving the University of Leeds to start her year-long exchange in Italy, Meredith was dead. Originally from Seattle, Washington, Amanda Knox first traveled to Italy when she was 15 years old and instantly fell in love. After graduating from the Seattle Preparatory School in 2005, she started studying linguistics at the University of Washington, while also working a part-time job to fund her upcoming study abroad program in Italy. She arrived in Italy on September 20th, 2007, and began studying at the University of Foreigners. She also started working at a bar called El Chic, which was owned by a guy named Patrick Lumumba, an important name that will pop up again a little later in the episode. Amanda first met 23-year-old Italian computer engineering student Raffaele Sollecito at a classical music concert about a month after arriving in Italy on October 25th, 2007. He was there with his father while Amanda attended with Meredith. Amanda and Raffaele struck up a conversation and immediately connected. They began dating and spent most of the following week together, often at Raffaele's apartment. And by the time Meredith was murdered, they had known each other for only about a week, but would eventually be tied together for a lifetime. November 1st, 2007 was a holiday in Italy, All Saints' Day. So Meredith's 2 Italian roommates and the men downstairs were all out of town. That night, Meredith had dinner and watched a movie with a few British girlfriends in a flat only about 500 yards away from her own. Then, at around 8:45 p.m., she returned back home. But because Amanda was staying over at her new boyfriend's place and her other 2 roommates were out of town, she was completely alone. Meredith's friends later said she was tired and planned to spend the rest of the evening studying before a class the following morning. Then at 8:56, shortly after arriving home, she attempted to call her mother in England, something she did almost every day. But the call ended before the 2 connected. After that, there were only a few brief and unusual bursts of activity from Meredith's phones. Exactly what she did inside the flat that night, or how long she was alone before someone else arrived, remains unclear. But sometime after returning home, she was attacked inside her bedroom. Amanda's original story was that she never returned to the flat that night. She said she and Raffaele spent the entire evening at his place. She had been scheduled to work at Le Chic, but shortly after 8 o'clock, her boss, Patrick Lumumba, texted to say she wasn't needed. So with their plans canceled, Amanda said she and Raffaele stayed home, smoked marijuana, watched Amelie, cooked dinner, had sex, and went to sleep. The next morning, November 2nd, she returned to the flat and immediately saw that the front door was open. She called out to see if anyone was home, but no one answered. Inside the bathroom she shared with Meredith, Amanda noticed several small drops of blood near the sink, and Meredith's bedroom door was closed and locked, but Amanda initially assumed she was sleeping. Despite the blood, Amanda took a shower and then went into the second bathroom to dry her hair. That was when she noticed that someone had left feces in the toilet without flushing. Feeling like something was off, Amanda returned to Raffaele's apartment and told him what she had seen. So the 2 then went back to the flat together. But this time, they discovered that a window in Filomena's bedroom had been broken, and the room appeared to have been ransacked. When Meredith still didn't answer her locked bedroom door, Raffaele tried unsuccessfully to force it open. He then called his sister, who was a police lieutenant, and asked what they should do, and she said he should call the police, which he did. Amanda then called her roommate, Filomena, and told her about the open front door, the blood in the bathroom, and the broken window in her bedroom. So Filomena immediately returned to the apartment with several friends. Concerned that there may have been a burglary, Filomena began checking through her belongings to see if anything had been stolen, unintentionally disturbing parts of what would soon become a crime scene. By then, 2 cell phones belonging to Meredith had been discovered in a nearby garden, making the situation even more scary. And that's when Philomena urged the police to force open Meredith's locked bedroom door, but they initially refused. Finally, at around 1:15, one of Philomena's friends forced the door open, and inside, they discovered Meredith dead, lying on the floor beneath a duvet. From the beginning, this was an extremely complicated crime scene. Several residents and friends had entered the apartment before the Italian police took control, and even when they did, the scene wasn't handled with care. Almost everything inside that flat was compromised when it came to the forensics. When Meredith's bedroom door was forced open, the scene inside immediately made it clear that this wasn't a burglary that had simply gone wrong. She was lying partially undressed on the floor, covered by a duvet with a lot of blood throughout the small bedroom, including on the floor, walls, bedding, and several nearby objects. Investigators found bloody shoe prints at the scene, as well as a bloody palm print on a pillow beneath Meredith's body. At the time, they didn't know who had left them, but both would later become important pieces of forensic evidence. Most of Meredith's clothes had been ripped from her body, and her bra had been cut or torn away. The small section containing its hooks, the bra clasp, had separated from the rest of the garment and was lying a few feet away. Investigators photographed it during their initial investigation, but for reasons that would later become extremely controversial, they didn't collect it as evidence. Much more on that a little later in the episode. An autopsy was performed by forensic pathologist Dr. Luca Lalli, and in his report, he documented numerous injuries and several cuts across Meredith's face, neck, hands, arms, and legs. Some of the injuries to her hands were consistent with an attempt to defend herself, while bruising around her mouth, nose, and jaw suggested that someone may have tried to silence or restrain her. But the worst injuries were the two to her neck. One was much deeper than the other and damaged blood vessels and structures in her throat. Dr. Lalli determined that Meredith died from the combined effects of severe blood loss and asphyxiation associated with those injuries. There was also evidence of an assault. The autopsy also raised questions about the weapon. The neck wounds were consistent with a sharp, single-edged knife, but experts disagreed over the size of the blade and whether both wounds could have been caused by the same weapon. And to make matters worse, no knife was ever recovered from the bedroom. That would later become especially important when investigators seized a large kitchen knife from Raffaele's apartment and claimed it had been used to kill Meredith. From the very beginning, Italian investigators were suspicious of Amanda, and most of that came from her perceived behavior in the hours after Meredith's body had been found. They just felt like she seemed unusually calm, even indifferent, for someone whose roommate had just been murdered. If you followed even a little bit of this case, then you've likely seen the photographs of Amanda and her boyfriend kissing and holding each other right outside the apartment. It's one of the first images that comes up on Google. To the rest of the world, those images appeared to show Amanda casually making out with her new boyfriend just feet away from the room where Meredith had been murdered. And without any more context, you can see how that might look. Cultural and language differences only added to investigators' suspicions. Amanda was a young American who spoke limited Italian, and behavior she may have intended as nervousness, confusion, or an attempt to cope was interpreted by police as cold, inappropriate, and even deceptive. Almost everything she did, the police saw as evidence that she was hiding something. Raffaele soon came under suspicion as well, largely because he was Amanda's alibi for the night of the murder. On November 5th, Amanda voluntarily went down to the police station but didn't bring a lawyer with her, and the police didn't provide her one because, under Italian law, They aren't required to, since she participated in the interview voluntarily and wasn't considered a suspect at the time. She was merely being treated as a witness. But as we're about to talk about, that perception clearly changed quickly. During that first interview, Amanda largely stuck to her original story that she stayed at her boyfriend's house on the night of the murder and didn't return until the following morning when Meredith's body was discovered. But it quickly became clear that police didn't believe her. Over the next 5 days, she was questioned repeatedly, reportedly for a combined total of roughly 53 hours. And throughout most of that time, she didn't have a lawyer present. And although an interpreter was eventually involved, Amanda later said her Italian was only at the level of a 10-year-old child. Exhausted, frightened, and under mounting pressure, Amanda's account slowly began to change. And during an overnight interrogation on November 5th, she signed statements placing herself inside the apartment and falsely identifying her boss, Patrick Lumumba, as Meredith's attacker. On the night of the murder, Amanda gets a text from her boss saying she doesn't need to come into work that night. She replies in Italian, "Ci vediamo più tardi." Now, to an Italian speaker, that literally translates to "see you later tonight," as if they had plans. But Amanda was just using a bad literal translation of the casual English idiom "see you later" to mean goodbye. So during her brutal interrogation, the police seized on this exact phrase, twisting a simple goodbye into a smoking gun to claim she was setting up a secret meeting with her boss on the night of the murder. Not only had she been questioned for hours and days on end, but the police were also screaming at her, calling her a liar, and even hitting her on the back of the head. Slowly but surely, they completely shattered her grip on reality by telling her she was suffering from traumatic amnesia and had blocked out the murder. So exhausted and gaslit, Amanda's brain essentially broke down. She started imagining what the police wanted to hear, mixing up dreams with reality, and she eventually signed a statement saying she was in the kitchen, covering her ears to block out Meredith's screams, while her boss, Patrick Lumumba, killed her. A completely fabricated scenario born entirely out of pure interrogation trauma. Years later, the European Court of Human Rights stepped in and blew the whistle on the entire operation. They would officially rule that Italy had violated Amanda's basic human rights, finding that the police fundamentally broke the rules by denying her a lawyer, failing to give her a competent translator, and ignoring her complaints of being mistreated. But that ruling came years later, and after this interrogation, the Italian authorities arrested Amanda, Raffaele, and Patrick on November 6, 2007, on suspicion of Meredith's murder. Patrick was eventually released about 2 weeks later when several customers at the bar told police they saw him there the entire night the murder took place. So he had a rock-solid alibi. And Amanda would later be convicted of slander for falsely accusing him. But Patrick's release created an obvious problem for the police's original narrative. The man Amanda had named wasn't at the flat that night. And while police had been solely focused on Amanda, Raffaele, and Patrick, the forensic evidence inside Meredith's bedroom was pointing towards someone else entirely. Investigators had recovered an unidentified bloody palm print, bloody shoe prints, and multiple DNA traces from the immediate crime scene, and not one belonged to Patrick Lumumba. Instead, the fingerprints would lead police to a fourth person, a man named Rudy Goudet. Rudy was 20 years old at the time of Meredith's murder and had lived in Italy since he was 5. He also wasn't a complete stranger to the people connected to the apartment, but he wasn't especially close to any of them either. Rudy said he had met the young Italian men who lived in the downstairs apartment while spending time at a nearby basketball court. They remembered knowing him, although none of them could say exactly when they had first met. And through those connections, Rudy had also briefly crossed paths with Amanda and Meredith. Then within just a few days of the murder, Rudy left Italy and traveled to Germany. But by that point, investigators had already matched his fingerprints and DNA to evidence recovered from Meredith's bedroom. German authorities eventually located and arrested him, and Rudy was extradited back to Italy to face questioning about Meredith's murder. When it came to the forensic evidence, there was a mountain of it connecting him to the murder. The first was that his DNA had been found inside Meredith's body, as well as on or near her clothing, and mixed with Meredith's blood on her handbag. And the feces left in the second bathroom, the same thing that Amanda saw that morning, were also linked to Rudy. Then there was the blood evidence. His bloody palm print was found on the pillow underneath Meredith's body, and there was a trail of bloody shoe prints matching his sneakers that began in her bedroom, then led out into the hallway and kitchen. But when confronted with this, Rudy admitted that he had been inside the apartment on the night Meredith was killed, but claimed he wasn't the person who attacked her. According to him, Meredith had invited him over, and the two began having consensual sexual contact. At some point, he claimed he developed stomach problems and went into the bathroom. And while he was there, he heard Meredith scream. Rudy said he came out of the bathroom and saw a man standing over her with a knife. He claimed the attacker fled and that he then tried to help Meredith by using towels to stop her bleeding. But instead of calling for help, he left and eventually fled Italy. But his story didn't make much sense. Not only did he change it several times, but it also didn't line up with the physical evidence. He could never explain why his bloody palm print was beneath Meredith's body or why his shoe prints traveled throughout the apartment. He also claimed that he had left Meredith fully dressed, which wasn't how she was found. Rudy initially said that Amanda wasn't there that night, but later claimed she had been there, eventually accusing her and Raffaele of being responsible. Rudy chose to be tried separately through Italy's fast-track process, which allowed the case to be decided on the existing evidence in exchange for a reduced potential sentence. And in October 2008, he was convicted of assaulting and murdering Meredith and initially sentenced to 30 years in prison. But that sentence was later reduced to 16 years. And while all the forensic evidence seemed to only lead back to him, investigators remained convinced that he hadn't acted alone, and they believed a kitchen knife recovered from Raffaele's apartment would finally prove Amanda was involved. On November 6th, while searching Raffaele's apartment, police seized a 17-centimeter knife from one of his kitchen drawers. That knife quickly became one of the prosecution's single most important pieces of evidence. In fact, it became known as the double DNA knife because investigators claimed it carried the DNA of both Amanda and Meredith. Several areas of the knife were tested, but only 2 produced DNA profiles. The first sample came from the handle, near the point where it met the blade. That profile belonged to Amanda, but that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise. The knife came from her boyfriend's kitchen, and Amanda had spent much of the previous week at his apartment. She had also helped prepare food there. But the second sample was a little trickier. A forensic analyst swabbed a small area of the blade where she said she could see several faint scratches. The amount of biological material recovered was extremely small, but after amplifying it, she produced a partial profile that she attributed to Meredith. And on the surface, that sounds really bad. Amanda's DNA was on the handle, Meredith's was reportedly on the blade, and Meredith had been killed with a knife. But this evidence was far from perfect. First, investigators found no visible blood on the knife. Chemical testing for blood also came back negative. Even the prosecution's forensic analyst acknowledged that the genetic material detected on the knife hadn't come from blood. There was also no way to determine what type of biological material had supposedly produced the profile. It couldn't be identified as blood, skin, saliva, or any other specific body fluid. The amount recovered from the blade was so small that the lab's initial measurement reportedly registered it as too low. This is what forensic scientists call low-template DNA, meaning only a tiny number of genetic copies may be available for testing. And when you're working with such a small sample, the risk of contamination just gets worse and worse. A few stray cells transferred through a glove, lab surface, instrument, or another piece of evidence can easily overwhelm the original sample and produce a misleading result. Normally, an important low-level result should be repeated to make sure the same profile appears again. But the entire sample from the blade was consumed during the original testing, so the result could never be independently reproduced. Prosecutors, nevertheless, argued that the knife had been used to kill Meredith and then thoroughly cleaned. They also claimed its dimensions were compatible with at least one of her neck wounds. But compatible doesn't mean it was the weapon. It simply means experts couldn't completely rule it out based on its general size and shape. There was nothing unique about the wounds that tied them specifically to that particular kitchen knife, and medical experts disagreed over whether the knife could have caused all of Meredith's injuries. During both Amanda and Raffaele's appeals, the court appointed two independent experts, Professors Stefano Conti and Carla Vecchiotti, to review the evidence. They both confirmed that Amanda's profile was on the handle, but after examining the lab records and raw testing data, they concluded that the profile attributed to Meredith on the blade was unreliable. Then in 2013, another previously untested area of the knife was examined. That testing again found nothing belonging to Meredith. Instead, the profile was consistent with Amanda, which again made sense for a knife kept inside a kitchen she regularly visited. Forensic geneticist Peter Gill later explained the central problem. DNA can potentially tell investigators whose biological material may be present on an object, but it can't reveal what that person was doing when it got there. Amanda's profile on the handle couldn't distinguish between her using the knife to prepare food and using it as a weapon. And the microscopic, unrepeatable trace attributed to Meredith couldn't reliably establish that the knife had ever been inside the apartment, much less that it had been used to kill her. Ultimately, Italy's highest court concluded that the knife evidence wasn't strong enough. So what prosecutors initially presented as the double DNA knife wasn't forensic proof that Amanda had killed Meredith. It was an ordinary kitchen knife carrying Amanda's expected profile, and one disputed microscopic trace that should never have been treated as conclusive evidence. But the knife wasn't the only disputed piece of forensic evidence prosecutors relied on. Their case against Raffaele would come down to another microscopic trace, this one found on the clasp of Meredith's bra. When investigators first went through Meredith's bedroom, they photographed it, but for some reason, it wasn't immediately collected or put into evidence. It remained inside Meredith's bedroom for the next 46 long days. And during that time, investigators repeatedly entered the apartment, and multiple objects inside the room were moved. When police returned for a second search on December 18th, the clasp was no longer where it had originally been photographed. It had traveled several feet across the floor and was eventually discovered beneath a small rug. The collection itself was recorded on video. And in the footage, investigators can be seen picking up the clasp, passing it between them, and placing it back onto the floor before finally collecting it. And at least one investigator's gloves appear dirty and can be seen handling different objects without changing them. When the clasp was tested, the largest profile belonged to Meredith, which was completely expected because it was hers. But analysts also detected a male profile that prosecutors attributed to Raffaele. To them, this was the evidence that finally placed him inside Meredith's bedroom during the attack. However, this wasn't a clean single-source sample. It was a complex mixture containing Meredith's profile, genetic markers attributed to Raffaele, and indications of biological material from additional unidentified male contributors. During the appeal, independent experts Stefano Conti and Carla Vecchiotti reviewed the collection video, lab records, and DNA results, and they agreed that parts of the genetic profile were consistent with Raffaele. But they concluded that investigators couldn't reliably establish when or how his DNA had reached the clasp. And that distinction is really, really important. Finding someone's DNA on an object doesn't automatically prove that person touched it directly. It can be transferred indirectly through another person or object, a process known as secondary transfer. For example, one person might touch a door handle. An investigator could later touch that same handle, then handle a piece of evidence without changing gloves. A small amount of DNA could move from the handle to the glove and finally onto the evidence, even though the original person never touched that evidence at all. When your mental health is suffering, therapy can help, but sometimes it's not the whole answer. Talk a Tree gives you access to real psychiatric care with licensed clinicians who can diagnose and prescribe medication if it's right for you. It's a 100% online psychiatry practice that provides comprehensive evaluations, diagnoses, and ongoing medication management for conditions like ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, PTSD, insomnia, and more. And because you continue with the same provider, you're not starting over each visit. Your treatment can evolve with you, so you're actually making progress over time. Head to talkayatree.com/tales and complete the short assessment to get matched with an in-network psychiatrist in just a few minutes. That's talkayatree.com/tales to get matched in minutes. We know that Raffaele had previously visited the apartment, and more importantly, on the morning Meredith was discovered, he touched the outside of her bedroom door while attempting to force it open. His fingerprints were later found there as well. So the defense argued that investigators could have picked up Raffaele's DNA from the door or another surface inside the apartment and then transferred it to the clasp during the second search. Now, that specific path of transfer couldn't be proven, but investigators also couldn't prove that it hadn't happened. And because the clasp had been left on the floor for 46 days, moved from its original position, and handled under very questionable conditions, the possibility of contamination couldn't be ignored. Then there was the additional male profile. If prosecutors believed Raffaele's DNA proved direct contact during the murder, they also had to explain why genetic markers from other unidentified men appeared in the same sample. And the problems don't stop there. The clasp couldn't be independently retested in its original condition because after the first test, it was stored in a liquid solution that caused the metal hooks to rust. The independent experts ultimately concluded that the DNA result was unreliable as proof of Raffaele's participation in the murder. Not necessarily because every marker attributed to him was imaginary, but because the collection and handling failures made it impossible to determine how or when the DNA arrived. Forensic geneticist Peter Gill later emphasized that identifying the possible source of DNA answers only one question: whose genetic material might be present? But it doesn't answer the more important questions of how it got there, when it got there, or what activity caused it to be transferred. And in this case, those questions were everything. The bra clasp was the only disputed piece of biological evidence prosecutors used to place Raffaele inside Meredith's bedroom. His DNA wasn't found on Meredith's body, in her blood, on the murder room floor, or on any other object associated with the attack. So the question wasn't simply whether portions of Raffaele's genetic profile appeared in the mixture. The question was whether investigators could prove that his DNA reached the clasp during Meredith's murder, and not through contamination or innocent transfer. Ultimately, they couldn't. Italy's highest court determined that the bra clasp evidence had no reliable probative value and could not establish that Raffaele had participated in Meredith's murder. But the knife and bra clasp were still only part of the prosecution's forensic case. Investigators also pointed to mixed DNA, luminol revealed footprints, a bloody bath mat, and what they believed was a staged burglary. Several samples from the bathroom Amanda and Meredith shared contained DNA from both women. Meredith's blood was found on the sink, bidet, floor mat, light switch, and other nearby surfaces. And in 3 locations, they found a mixture of both Meredith and Amanda. Prosecutors argued that Amanda may have washed Meredith's blood from herself in the bathroom, leaving both women's biological material behind. But a mixed profile doesn't necessarily mean that the 2 women's blood was mixed together. Testing identifies genetic material, but it doesn't always identify the bodily fluid that produced it. Meredith's blood could have landed on a surface where Amanda's skin cells, saliva, or another innocent source of DNA was already present, and Amanda lived there. She used that sink and bathroom every single day, and had even showered there on the morning Meredith's body was discovered. So finding her DNA in her own bathroom makes complete sense, and it certainly doesn't prove murder. Investigators also returned to the apartment in December and sprayed several floors with luminol, a chemical that glows when it reacts with certain substances. When most people hear the word luminol, they think of blood, but it isn't specific to just that. It can also react with bleach, some metals, cleaning products, and certain plant materials. In this case, the luminol revealed several footprint-shaped impressions in Amanda's bedroom and the hallway. And based on visual comparisons, investigators said some appeared compatible with Amanda's bare feet and another with Raffaele's. Prosecutors claimed these were bloody footprints that had been cleaned but were still visible under luminol. But that's not the entire story. Follow-up testing with another chemical known as TMB didn't confirm blood in the foot impressions. A negative TMB result doesn't absolutely prove that blood was never present, because luminol can sometimes detect smaller or more diluted traces. But it meant investigators couldn't simply assume every glowing footprint had been made in Meredith's blood. Some of the impressions also produced Amanda's DNA, but once again, they were located on floors inside her own home, including her bedroom. So the presence of Amanda's DNA didn't identify whatever substance had caused the luminol reaction or prove that the footprints were connected to the murder. Then there was a visible, partial bloody footprint found on the bath mat in the shared bathroom. A prosecution expert said its size and shape were compatible with Raffaele's foot and incompatible with Rudy's. But a defense expert reached the opposite conclusion, arguing that it was closer to Rudy's. The problem was that the impression was incomplete. Its heel extended beyond the edge of the mat, and the absorbent fabric had distorted the blood as it spread through the fibers. And unlike a fingerprint or a DNA profile, this type of footprint comparison depends heavily on measurements and visual interpretation. The prosecution believed the broken window in Filomena's bedroom had been staged to make the murder appear to be the result of a burglary, and they specifically pointed to the height of the second-story window, the large rock found inside the room, and the placement of broken glass and scattered belongings. Investigators thought someone already inside the apartment had broken the window and disturbed the room after Meredith was killed. But that theory was also disputed. Witnesses disagreed about whether glass was lying on top of or beneath the scattered clothing, and the scene had already been disturbed when Philomena searched through her belongings. So none of the evidence tells us who broke the window, when it was broken, or whether it represented a genuine break-in. And this brings us to the most important forensic fact in the case. Despite the large amount of blood and biological material inside Meredith's bedroom, Amanda's DNA, blood, fingerprints, and hair weren't found anywhere inside the murder room or on Meredith's body. Aside from the disputed bra clasp result, the same was true for Raffaele. Meanwhile, only Rudy's was found on Meredith and her belongings. That's the difference between DNA being present, it being relevant, and it proving participation in a crime. Those are not all the same things. But even with all those issues with the forensic evidence, the Italian system still got 3 convictions out of this. In December 2009, a now 22-year-old Amanda Knox was convicted of faking a break-in, defamation, sexual violence, and murder, and was sentenced to 26 years in prison. And her boyfriend, Raffaele, was sentenced to 25 years. For the Italian authorities, this was a victory. It was case closed. One Italian professor even said, "This is the simplest and fairest criminal trial one could possibly think of in terms of evidence." While authorities in the United States completely disagreed, saying the convictions were a huge miscarriage of justice. But these convictions were just the tip of the iceberg. 2 years later, in 2011, both Amanda and Raffaele had their cases heard in front of an Italian appellate court. After court-appointed experts exposed serious problems with the knife and bra clasp DNA, Amanda and Raffaele were found not guilty of Meredith's murder, and their convictions were overturned. After spending nearly 4 years in custody, Amanda got her freedom back, but not for long. In March of 2013, Italy's highest court overturned the acquittal and ordered another trial, ruling that the appeals court hadn't properly considered all of the evidence. Then during the retrial, another sample from the kitchen knife was tested, but once again, no DNA belonging to Meredith was found. But despite that result, Amanda and Raffaele were found guilty for a second time in January 2014. Amanda remained in the United States while Raffaele stayed in Italy. But they weren't done fighting. They appealed once again. And on March 27, 2015, Italy's highest court definitively acquitted them, bringing the years-long legal battle to an end. The court didn't simply say there was reasonable doubt. It ruled that Amanda and Raffaele hadn't participated in the murder and criticized the investigation, citing serious errors, omissions, and possible contamination of key evidence. Most importantly, the court found no reliable biological evidence connecting either one of them to Meredith's body or the room where she was killed. It all came down to the forensic evidence. Amanda's separate conviction for falsely accusing Patrick Lumumba remained in place, but she had already served the sentence during her nearly 4 years in prison. For her, the 2015 ruling ended the murder case, but it didn't end her connection to Meredith's death in the public eye. Today, she lives near Seattle with her husband, writer Christopher Robinson, and their 2 children. She has written books, co-hosts the podcast Labyrinths, and works as an advocate for people who have been wrongfully accused or convicted. She has also continued fighting her separate slander conviction for falsely accusing Patrick Lumumba. Despite a European court finding that her rights were violated during the interrogation, Italy's highest court upheld that conviction in 2025. But while Amanda's arrest, trials, acquittals, books, documentaries, and television appearances have received international attention, Meredith's family has spent nearly 2 decades watching her become secondary in the story of her own murder. Her parents and siblings traveled repeatedly between England and Italy for hearings, verdicts, and appeals, each time reliving the details of Meredith's final night. And every new trial, documentary, book, or television series brought the case back into the headlines. Meredith's sister, Stephanie, once said that Mez has been forgotten in all of this, explaining that it had become difficult for the family to keep her memory alive amid the constant attention surrounding Amanda. The family has also expressed frustration with new projects that continue revisiting the case. But through it all, they have tried to remind people that Meredith was more than the victim at the center of a famous murder trial. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. She was an intelligent and adventurous 21-year-old who had traveled to Italy to study its language and culture. As Stephanie later said, Meredith's legacy would always be one of friendship and kindness, something no amount of media attention could ever change. So, what did the DNA evidence actually prove? In Rudy's case, it connected him directly to Meredith and the immediate crime scene. His DNA was recovered from her body, clothing, and handbag. His bloody palm print was found on the pillow beneath her, and his bloody shoe prints traveled from her bedroom into the rest of the apartment. But the evidence against Amanda and Raffaele was very different. Amanda's DNA was found on the handle of a kitchen knife inside her boyfriend's apartment, a place where she regularly spent time and prepared food. That established that she had likely handled the knife, but it didn't prove that she had used it to kill Meredith. The microscopic trace on the blade that prosecutors attributed to Meredith couldn't be reliably confirmed. It didn't come from blood, the original test couldn't be repeated, and independent experts determined that contamination had not been adequately ruled out. Then there was the bra clasp, the only disputed biological evidence used to place Raffaele inside Meredith's bedroom. It had been left on the floor for 46 days, moved several feet from its original location, and handled under conditions that created a serious risk of contamination. And that's the limitation of DNA that often gets lost in a courtroom. It may help identify whose biological material is present, but it cannot independently explain when it was left there, how it arrived, or what someone was doing when it was left behind. And when jurors hear phrases like DNA match, mixed profile, or compatible with, the evidence can sound far more conclusive than it really is. Meredith Kercher's murder demonstrates both the power of DNA and its limitations. When it is properly collected, tested, and interpreted within the context of the entire crime scene, it can help identify a killer. But when microscopic traces are separated from that context and contamination cannot be excluded, the same science can implicate people who were never part of the crime. Rudy remains the only person definitively convicted of Meredith's murder. But after years of sensational headlines, documentaries, and courtroom battles, perhaps one of the greatest injustices is that Meredith became a supporting character in the story of her own death. Her name was Meredith Kercher. She was 21 years old, deeply loved by her family and friends, and had traveled to Italy expecting the beginning of an unforgettable new chapter. She should be remembered not for the trials or the famous names connected to her case, but for the life she lived, the future stolen from her, and the people who continue to carry her memory. To share your thoughts on this week's story, be sure to follow us on social media at Forensic Tales. And if you want to listen to new episodes, early and ad-free, consider signing up for our Patreon at patreon.com/forensictales. You can get early, ad-free access to new episodes and monthly full-length bonus episodes for as little as $3 a month. Your support on Patreon directly helps to fund the show's production, research, and editing costs. And as an independent one-woman podcast, your support truly helps to keep this show going. Forensic Tales is a Rockefeller audio production. The The show is written and produced by me, Courtney Fretwell. If you'd like to support the show and help fund research, production, and editing, you can do so with a small monthly contribution on Patreon. Patreon supporters get early access to ad-free episodes and exclusive bonus content. You can learn more at patreon.com/Forensic Tales. Thank you so much to this week's newest supporters, Stacy B, Bill H, Vanessa C, and Christina T. And if you enjoy the show, leaving a positive rating or review really helps others discover it. For a full list of sources used in this episode, visit forensictales.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week. Until then, remember, not all stories have happy endings.
Meet Keith, loving dad, board game champ, bus driving pro.
I drive 65,000 miles in my bus each year. If people knew what I know, lives could be saved. Like how there are some things I simply can't see. On my route the other day, a car tried to sneak past me and ends up right in my blind spot. I turned slowly, so accident avoided. But no car should be in the blind spot for a 40,000-pound bus. It's our roads. It's our safety.
Visit www.sharetheroadsafely.gov.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.